They thought I'd roll over for a $100 fine. They didn't know I'd spent the last 5 years of studying their every move, and they just handed me the perfect opportunity to destroy them. The letter came on a Tuesday. Plain envelope, no return address, slipped into the mailbox like it was a shame to be there. Inside, a single sheet of paper, glossy, impersonal, printed in Times New Roman like it was a funeral announcement. Notice of fine, $100 for unauthorized garden edging. That's all it said. No warning, no conversation. Just a demand. The edging wasn't new. It had been there since the day the protagonist moved in, a thin strip of stone separating grass from flower bed. Tasteful, neutral, barely visible from the street. It wasn't neon paint or some kitschy garden gnome. It was gray slate understated. Still, they called it unauthorized. A violation. It was the third fine in 2 months. The first was for leaving the trash bins out for 22 minutes past the allowed retrieval window. The second? A rogue dandelion that had bloomed overnight and was spotted by one of the HOA's ever-watchful compliance officers. This third one, though it wasn't about edging, it was about control. The protagonist stared at the paper, then laid it flat on the kitchen counter. They didn't react. No yelling, no crumpling, no dramatic declaration of revenge. Just a slow inhale, a slight squint of the eyes, and a memory from 2 years back. That was the first time they noticed something off. A board meeting where the budget didn't add up. A neighbor fined for a fence they'd had for 6 years. A whisper about the president's cousin getting a landscaping contract without a vote. They'd started keeping notes back then, quietly, just out of curiosity at first. Not because they had a plan. But now, that curiosity had weight. The fine wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the moment the HOA crossed a line they didn't even know existed. Outside, the lawn shimmered under the late spring sun. Birds chirped. Sprinklers ticked softly across driveways. It was the kind of neighborhood real estate agents used to sell dreams. The kind where everyone smiled, but no one really spoke. Where conformity wasn't just expected, it was enforced. The HOA board thrived on that silence. The protagonist had never gone to war with them. Not openly. They attended meetings, nodded along, asked the occasional question. Never caused a stir. But that was the thing. They noticed everything. The meetings that ended too quickly. The reports that were not available at this time. The same 3 people getting re-elected without contest. And every time a neighbor was fined into submission, a new line was added to a growing spreadsheet stored in a folder named Miscellaneous 7. Something no one would ever click on. The $100 fine sat there, still unread by anyone else. They didn't need to share it with a neighbor. No need to complain on a community forum. That wasn't how this would be handled. Instead, they walked to their office, opened the spreadsheet, and typed. Fine number 34, 6/3, $100. Edging, existing since 2022. No prior notice. Retaliation suspected. The document already held 33 other entries. Fines issued to various neighbors. Quotes from bylaws. Screenshots of emails. Photos of board members' properties with the same violations left unpunished. The hypocrisy was baked in like mold and drywall. There was also a file marked financial discrepancies. 5 folders deep. Password locked. Cross-referenced against the public budgets filed annually and the actual expenditures witnessed on the street. There were contracts listed for tree trimming that never happened. Mulch delivered at triple the retail price. And a maintenance company that didn't exist outside a P.O. box, linked to the HOA treasurer's brother-in-law. All of it had been sitting there, dormant, until now. The protagonist didn't need the $100. But this wasn't about money. It was about the shift. The feeling when power assumes it can't be challenged. When an institution believes its mask is so pretty no one will look beneath it. They went outside, stood at the edge of the garden. The edging looked exactly as it always had. Neat, clean, precise. They knelt and pulled one of the stones up. It came loose easily. They looked at the underside. A little earth, a root tangled around the edge. Then they replaced it. Gently. Let them come inspect it again. Inside, they opened their laptop and queued up a request through the HOA's online portal. It looked routine. A request to view recent meeting minutes and financial records from the last fiscal year. Harmless. Boring. but it triggered a timer, one the board was legally bound to acknowledge within 7 days. They didn't know it, but their clock had just started. The protagonists didn't need to raise their voice. They wouldn't make a scene. That's what the HOA always counted on. People getting angry, reacting emotionally, ranting on social media, and then giving up when nothing changed. But this wasn't rage. It was clarity. They printed a copy of the violation letter and placed it in a drawer labeled leverage. One among many. A paper cut to the board, meaningless alone, but deadly in numbers. Outside, sprinklers rotated in slow, mechanical arcs. Neighbors walked dogs and waved politely, oblivious to the war that had just begun. One neighbor had once described the HOA as a necessary evil. Another had called it a blessing in disguise. But the protagonist had another term in mind, a target. And the best part? The board didn't even know, they just pulled the trigger. It started small. A copy of a meeting agenda slipped under the door. A strange line in the community budget. A neighbor's complaint dismissed with no explanation. None of it felt big at the time. Just noise. But that's how the file began, one quiet entry at a time. Back then, the protagonist had no plan to go against the HOA. They weren't looking for a fight. It was curiosity mostly, a sense that something wasn't adding up. The community looked pristine on the outside, but there was a rot forming beneath the foundation, subtle, easy to ignore unless you were really paying attention. So they started writing things down. Nothing dramatic. A logbook at first, just dates and details. Then a spreadsheet, clean, organized, expandable. Over time, it grew. Names of board members, years of service, contract holders, companies paid by the HOA. Cross-references, notes about relationships, who played golf together, who moved in after whom, who suddenly got their violations waived after a quick visit to the board office. It wasn't paranoia. It was discipline. They noticed things others didn't. Like how the board president's front yard lighting didn't follow regulation wattage, but no citation was ever issued. Or how the treasurer's son won a maintenance contract at double the cost of the previous vendor. No one talked about it. No one wanted to. That was the real power of the HOA, not in fines or bylaws, but in silence. In convincing everyone that speaking up would only make it worse. But silence worked both ways. The protagonist never spoke up either, not publicly. They smiled at board members during meetings, asked boring questions, took notes like a model citizen. But behind closed doors, they were building something meticulous. The file had folders, dozens of them, each named after a board member, each filled with screenshots, PDFs, audio recordings of open meetings, legal documents, bylaws annotated with discrepancies, photos of violations left unpunished. One folder just for landscaping contracts, another for election irregularities, like how notices for nominations were sent out 2 days late every single year. They even had a log of complaints filed by residents, some rejected, some lost, others mysteriously answered with copy-paste responses. One woman down the street had filed a request to repaint her shutters. It was denied 3 times. 3 weeks later, the HOA secretary's cousin painted his in the same color and was approved immediately. Patterns emerged. The protagonists didn't rush them. They watched, studied, waited. Every once in a while, something big would pop up. Like the time the HOA spent $12,000 on holiday lights that no one ever saw. Or the sudden replacement of a contractor after rumors that they'd asked too many questions about payment schedules. Those went into a folder marked high leverage. Still, there was no clear endgame. No lawsuit. No uprising. Just quiet accumulation. Until the $100 fine arrived. It was petty, insulting, but more importantly, it was personal. For the first time, the file wasn't just insurance, it was ammunition. They sat down and opened the main document. It had grown beyond a spreadsheet. It was a map, a network, a story of how power had been slowly, carefully abused under the guise of community improvement. And now, finally, there was motive. The fine wasn't random. It was the HOA reminding them of their place. But they had a different message in mind. Clicking through the folders, they began connecting dots. Contracts awarded to shell companies. Budgets that didn't align with receipts. A quote for sidewalk repairs submitted by 3 companies, 2 real, 1 fake. The fake one was chosen. The payment was made, but no repairs were ever completed. There were emails too. Not hacked, just poorly protected. Meeting reminders sent from personal accounts. Requests forwarded from board members to family businesses. Each one time-stamped. Each one copied into the file. A neighbor had once mentioned how his complaint about mold on the community clubhouse wall was resolved, even though no one ever showed up to inspect it. Another neighbor's car had been towed from their own driveway after a supposed rule change, one that never appeared in the official documents. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a pattern, a strategy. The protagonist had even managed to attend an unofficial social gathering of the board once. A backyard barbecue, open to the public, sort of. No decisions made, of course, not officially, but comments were dropped. Offhand remarks, boasts about keeping certain people in line, and jokes about how no one reads the bylaws anyway. The recording app on the phone worked just fine that night. Now all of it had a purpose. They printed out a few key documents, just a handful for now. A contractor's invoice with a fake address. A maintenance schedule that listed work completed on days it rained. A board vote conducted via group text, never logged in the minutes. These weren't just curiosities anymore. They were leverage, the kind that didn't just win arguments. It collapsed regimes. Back at the computer, the protagonist created a new folder. Actionable. They moved the strongest pieces of evidence there, sorted by risk level, legal exposure, likelihood of triggering a response. The plan wasn't just to fight a fine. It was to remove the mask from a machine that had operated in darkness for too long. But not all at once. It had to be strategic. The first request had already gone out, documents legally required to be shared. That alone would trigger unease. Questions. If the board refused or delayed, that was another violation. Another entry in the file. The beauty of it was this. The board had no idea they were in a game. They thought it was just another homeowner complaining about a minor fee. They didn't realize they were standing on a trapdoor, one built slowly, brick by brick, mistake by mistake. The protagonist leaned back in the chair. Outside, the perfect neighborhood stretched in every direction, calm, quiet, oblivious. But under that calm, a file, a plan, and soon a reckoning. The next move was quiet. No threats, no confrontation, just an online request submitted through the HOA's internal portal. Per Article 5, Section 3 of the bylaws, I am formally requesting access to the past 12 months of board meeting minutes, approved financial reports, and vendor contracts related to maintenance and landscaping. It looked harmless, legal, boring even, but the language was specific, deliberate, and more importantly, it forced the HOA into a corner. They couldn't deny it without violating their own transparency rules, and they couldn't fulfill it without exposing cracks. Either way, the trap was set. The board didn't know who had submitted it. The portal didn't display resident names publicly, just a case number. To them, it was just another tedious records request from some homeowner with too much time on their hands. But that uncertainty, that not knowing, was the first seed of paranoia. Meanwhile, the protagonist kept moving. They started showing up at the monthly HOA meetings again. Not in any dramatic fashion. Just sitting in the back, scribbling in a notebook, always early, never speaking unless asked. The board took notice, of course. There was something unnerving about someone who said nothing, but was always watching. The board president, a man who wore expensive polos like armor, tried to maintain a tone of fake friendliness during the meetings. Any questions from the room? He'd ask, smiling too wide, glancing at the protagonist like he was trying to make eye contact with a shadow. There were no questions. Not yet. Outside those meetings, the protagonist was careful. Every interaction with a neighbor was short but meaningful. A compliment about someone's garden. A question about whether they'd received any recent fines. Most said no. A few said yes. One for a barely visible crack in their driveway, another for a flag mounted on the porch at the wrong angle. These weren't accidents. They were warnings, subtle power plays, and the protagonist realized that the board's strength didn't come from bylaws. It came from fear and confusion, the kind that spread through silence and kept people in check. So the next step was to break that silence without ever revealing their identity. They began leaving small envelopes on doorsteps, anonymous. Inside each was a photocopy of something real, a line from the HOA budget showing thousands paid to a non-existent vendor, a quote from a meeting transcript where the board casually admitted they never mailed out the election notices on time. One envelope contained just a photo, the board vice president's house with unapproved paint colors and no violation notice. No explanations, no threats, just the truth. The effect was immediate. The whispers began. On sidewalks, in backyards, at mailboxes. Did you get one of those letters? Who do you think sent them? Wait, that landscaping company doesn't exist. The neighborhood had always been too polite for gossip. But now, suspicion had become contagious. At the next meeting, attendance doubled. People came not to participate, but to watch. The board fumbled through the agenda. The president's voice cracked. Someone from the back, not the protagonist, asked about a line item marked Discretionary Beautification Fund, $3,400. The board froze. They hadn't prepared for questions. After the meeting, the treasurer was seen pacing in the parking lot, whispering furiously into her phone. The secretary avoided eye contact altogether. And still, the protagonist said nothing. Back at home, they updated the log. Each reaction cataloged. Each board member's shift in demeanor recorded. It wasn't about chaos. It was about pressure. Enough to make them sweat, but not enough to make them bolt. Yet, the protagonist then turned to public records. County filings. Contractor licenses. They found discrepancies. Businesses paid by the HOA that didn't exist in the local registry. Addresses that led to empty lots. One company's phone number redirected to a voicemail that hadn't been set up. These were added to the file. The beauty of it all was that the sabotage wasn't loud. It was surgical, not a wrecking ball, but a scalpel. Each action cut away at the false image the board had built of competence, control, and order. And because the protagonist never showed their face, the paranoia grew stronger. The board began sending more emails, more urgent notices about community compliance. They reminded residents of the power of fines, of the importance of following guidelines, of how misinformation could cause unrest. But those emails only confirmed one thing. They were rattled. Still, the protagonist remained a ghost. No signatures, no footprints, just a faint impression of someone out there who knew, someone who wasn't afraid. One night, the board president walked the neighborhood alone. He paused in front of the protagonist's house. Not for long, just enough to look. The lawn was perfect. The edging, immaculate. Nothing to report. He moved on. The message had been received. Inside, the protagonist watched from the dark, unseen. They didn't smile. This wasn't about revenge. It was about erosion, of trust, of power, of the illusion that the HOA was untouchable. And they weren't finished. Not yet. The real damage was still coming. It started with a single email, and signed and sent from a temporary address, carefully worded and laced with polite curiosity. It was forwarded to 15 residents and simply posed a question. Did you know the HOA paid over $3,000 to a company that isn't licensed in the state? Attached was a copy of the contract, extracted from the publicly disclosed financial report the board assumed no one would ever request, and a link to the state business registry, where the company's name returned nothing. There was no accusation, no dramatic subject line, just one piece of documented truth. Within hours, that email had been forwarded dozens of times, and whispers turned into full conversations. Suddenly, at driveway meetups and dog parks, neighbors began talking openly about things they'd once only thought privately. How strange it was that some people seemed immune to violations, how the election notices never arrived on time, how maintenance requests were often ignored, unless you were connected. The protagonist wasn't done. Over the next week, more documents appeared, slipped under doormats, taped to community bulletin boards, left in community mailboxes in unmarked envelopes. One included photos of the board's secretary's backyard, which violated at least 3 landscaping rules, yet had never received a single notice. Another showed inconsistencies between the HOA's posted annual budget and the actual bank statement, obtained through a formal document request. Another revealed that the same family names kept appearing on vendor contracts, none of them properly disclosed. It was all quiet, faceless, methodical. The protagonist never claimed credit and never spoke a word. They let the truth speak for itself, just loud enough for people to hear, but not so loud that it felt like a war. Not yet. Then came the petitions. An anonymous stack appeared in the community clubhouse one morning, clipped together and stamped for transparency. The heading read, "Request for a special meeting to review board financial practices." Attached was a list of concerns, not accusations, just questions, each backed by a document. Who approved the beautification expense in April? Why was the budget posted 2 months late? Why was no vendor contact information ever shared with residents, despite legal requirement? People began to sign. The board reacted predictably. Defensive, dismissive. They issued a mass email condemning baseless rumors and misinformation, which only made things worse. The email did not address any of the concerns raised, nor did it explain the discrepancies. Residents who had never cared much about HOA politics suddenly felt a knot in their stomach, that maybe the system they trusted wasn't just flawed, but manipulated. The next board meeting was standing room only. Chairs ran out within minutes. People stood in the back, lining the walls, arms folded, copies of the flyers in their hands. The board looked nervous. The president opened with a speech about unity and not letting outside forces sow discord. But the crowd didn't clap. Someone raised their hand and asked about the non-existent vendor. Another asked why the financials still hadn't been updated. A third calmly asked why the board kept avoiding questions and whether a forensic audit was being considered. The president's jaw twitched. The treasurer looked pale. The secretary dropped her pen. No one in the room suspected the person responsible was standing quietly among them, in the back, nodding like everyone else. The protagonist didn't need to confront them. That would have ruined everything. It was better to watch them unravel on their own. After that meeting, things escalated. Residents started organizing. Not against the board, not yet, but around it. They created a group chat. Someone suggested forming an independent review committee. Another offered to contact a journalist. The protagonist watched as momentum gathered, not from rage, but from something more powerful, collective realization. They had been afraid of the HOA, but now the HOA was afraid of them. And still, the protagonist stayed silent. They kept planting seeds, an anonymous Google Drive link shared among neighbors, filled with organized folders of every financial irregularity, a timeline of violation notices with patterns of selective enforcement. Even a list of homeowners who'd served on nominating committees multiple times, with evidence that no one else was ever invited. Nothing was fabricated. Every single piece of information was real, traceable, and verifiable. That was the genius of it. There was no need for slander or exaggeration. The truth, as it turned out, was devastating enough. Soon, the board began to fracture. The vice president resigned quietly, citing health reasons. The treasurer stopped showing up to meetings. The board president tried to hold things together, sending out cheerful community updates about summer barbecues and lawn care tips. But they landed flat. No one cared about potlucks anymore, not when thousands of dollars were unaccounted for. A letter arrived at every household 1 week later. It was formal, cold, defensive. The board was officially canceling all unfounded document requests and warned of legal action against those who spread disinformation. But by then, the community had stopped listening. The power had shifted. The spell had broken. What the board didn't understand was that the fear they once wielded like a sword had been turned back on them. And the person who had quietly, facelessly flipped that balance, still unseen, still unknown. The protagonist walked the same sidewalks as before, passing the same homes, waving politely. They nodded when others talked about who might be behind it. They shrugged when someone suggested hiring an auditor. But inside, they knew the board had already lost. It wasn't about loud rebellion. It was erosion. Piece by piece, Truth had slipped through the cracks in their polished armor. And now, the community didn't just want answers. They demanded them. And soon, the protagonist would give them exactly that, in court. It wasn't the HOA that filed first. It was the protagonist. And it wasn't about the $100 fine. That was just the beginning. The lawsuit was about systematic abuse of authority, violation of homeowner rights, failure to disclose financial records, and misuse of community funds. Filed under a lawyer's name the board had never seen before, the complaint hit them like a hammer. They didn't see it coming because they never imagined someone would actually go that far. For years, they counted on quiet frustration, on people giving up after a few angry emails. But this wasn't a warning shot. This was war, on paper, in court, with the weight of evidence stacked so precisely it looked like a blueprint. The complaint was clean and clinical, yet damning. 47 exhibits were attached, including screenshots, documents obtained through legally binding requests, copies of the HOA's own budgets and minutes, and photographs of community violations that were enforced selectively. The board panicked. An emergency meeting was called, off record, unannounced. But someone leaked the agenda, and a copy appeared online within hours. One bullet point stood out: legal exposure from recent homeowner litigation. The protagonists stayed invisible. They never showed their face at any of the panicked town halls that followed, never raised their voice in the forums. They let the board's silence and missteps speak louder than any accusation. The court filing forced discovery, and that's when things got worse for the HOA. They tried to stall, claimed they didn't have access to certain documents, claimed the records were outdated or lost. But emails and screenshots told a different story. So did timestamps. There were receipts for jobs that had never been done, checks written to companies that shared last names with board members. There were elections conducted without proper notice, minutes that skipped key motions, and budget surpluses that mysteriously vanished before year-end audits. Under oath, board members began to slip. The treasurer admitted that she didn't know who had signed some of the contracts. They were just there when I came in. The secretary couldn't explain why two versions of the same budget existed. The board president, once smug and dismissive, cracked during deposition when asked why the landscaping company had no verifiable employees. The HOA's attorney asked for a closed mediation. The protagonists declined. They wanted it all on record. Then the media caught wind. A small local paper picked up the story: a neighborhood lawsuit over financial abuse. The headline was quiet, but it got attention. Comments flooded in. People in other communities with other HOAs began sharing similar stories. The protagonist's neighborhood stopped being just a backdrop. It became a case study. Within the community, people rallied. Some feared retaliation, others welcomed the pressure. A petition was circulated to remove the current board entirely. The community group chat overflowed, with residents volunteering for new elections. HOA signs were torn down. One night, someone spray-painted $100, tried $10,000 on the back wall of the clubhouse. The board tried damage control. They sent out long letters filled with apologies, non-apologies, and vague promises of reform. They claimed that the lawsuit was unfortunate and not representative of the spirit of the community. But it was too late. When the trial date was set, the board folded. They offered a settlement: $10,000 in damages, the resignation of 3 board members, and the agreement to bring in an independent auditor to investigate all financial activity from the past 5 years. They also promised to hold a transparent election process under third-party supervision. The protagonists accepted, not because they needed the money, but because they'd already won. The $100 fine was gone. The people who issued it gone. The system that protected them cracked open. The documents gathered over years had finally served their purpose. What began as quiet observation ended as a landmark case for the community, and a warning to any HOA that assumed silence meant submission. There was no celebration, no public statement. The protagonists didn't post online, didn't brag, didn't gloat. They deposited the check, submitted one final document to the clerk's office, and returned home to their quiet, rule-compliant lawn. The garden edging was still there, still unauthorized, technically, but no one said anything now. They watered the plants that morning with steady hands. Down the block, a neighbor waved. Another gave a thumbs up. The air was clearer, quieter, not because someone shouted, but because someone paid attention, because someone knew how to move in silence, because someone finally said, "Enough." The morning after the settlement, the neighborhood felt eerily still. No email from the HOA. No violation notices slipped under doorways. No reminder about approved lawn heights or the upcoming paint palette deadline. The usual noise, bureaucratic, distant smug, had gone silent. The board president was gone. So was the treasurer. The secretary had stepped down quietly a day earlier, citing unforeseen family obligations. Their names had disappeared from the community portal, replaced by placeholders, position vacant. It was the first time in years that power wasn't concentrated in the same closed circle. And the protagonist? Still faceless. Still unnamed. They didn't attend the town meeting held 2 days later. But they didn't need to. They already knew what would happen. The resignation statements were read aloud. Dry, formulaic, filled with words like gratitude and service. But the community didn't clap. They didn't mourn the departure. They just sat still listening, watching, processing. Then someone stood up and said what everyone else was thinking. This never should have taken a lawsuit. That comment cracked the atmosphere. Others followed, calm but firm. Questions about how finances were approved without consent. About why no one ever received election notices. About the tone of the violation letters, the inconsistency of enforcement, the refusal to answer questions at board meetings. It wasn't just one problem. It had been a culture. The interim chair, a soft-spoken retiree who'd volunteered reluctantly, promised reforms. He mentioned open records, resident oversight, and staggered term limits. Words that had always been in the bylaws, but never honored. Now, they were not just suggestions, they were demands. Outside that meeting, the community started changing in small but visible ways. A neighbor who had previously received 3 back-to-back violations installed a new porch swing with no complaint. Another painted their shutters a color not technically listed in the handbook, and no one said a word. Children began drawing with chalk on sidewalks again. Flags flew. Chairs were left out overnight. Life resumed, not in chaos, but in quiet defiance of a system that had mistaken order for control. The protagonists sat on their porch, watching it all, not gloating, just observing, as they always had. A neighbor walked by with her dog, pausing by the edge of the lawn. "You ever figure out who did it?" she asked with a smile. The protagonist just shrugged. Someone who was paying attention, I guess. She nodded, thoughtful, before walking on. That was enough. The board was audited, just as promised. The third-party team revealed everything the protagonist had already documented. Tens of thousands in questionable spending, votes that never happened, minutes rewritten after meetings, maintenance budgets funneled into cosmetic updates near board members' homes. It wasn't criminal, not all of it, but it was damning. The community saw, in black and white, how far the rot had spread. New elections were held under supervision. This time, real ballots were mailed. Candidates introduced themselves publicly. Debates were held on neutral ground. Residents actually listened. They asked hard questions. People who had never spoken up before now had something to say. The board that emerged was new, younger, more diverse, more aware. Not perfect, but alert. They didn't promise to fix everything overnight, just to never let silence rule again. And as for the protagonist, they kept to themselves. They tended their now completely compliant garden, the same edging still in place, untouched. Not a single complaint about it now. It had become a quiet monument. Proof that sometimes a battle starts with something as small as a stone in the grass. They still received occasional envelopes from neighbors, anonymous thank yous, theories, suspicions. One even jokingly offered to put their name up for neighborhood hero. But the protagonist never responded. The point had never been recognition. It had been about reclaiming control, not just from a board, but from fear, from the idea that if you speak, you'll be punished, that the rules only apply to the powerless, that institutions can hide behind process and paper. Now, people weren't afraid to knock on each other's doors, to ask questions, to demand fairness. Change didn't come through rage. It came through patience, through proof, through quiet resolve sharpened over time. That $100 fine, the one that started it all, was now a story people told over dinner, almost like a local legend. Most didn't know the full truth. They just knew someone stood up in the shadows and said, "No more." And from that silence, something real began. A better community, a humble board, and a garden that never looked more alive.